Thanks very much, everybody. I think the order of our presentations is gone very well in that we've had an introduction to the program and a really concrete example of a hub. I'm going to get into some more detail on legal structuring, some tips and traps, as I call it. And I guess we can go to the next slide. So when you're structuring your hub, I think there's a number of considerations. And when I say you, I'm talking about all of the different partner organizations. So some broad considerations, and this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. So first of all is think about the impact of the structure that you create on each participant's reputation. The control or influence over decision making, that's going to be obviously a very critical one. What is your role? How much do you want to lead what's happening? It sounds like from Bill's situation, Lang's has a significant amount of control. In other situations, there may be more needed collaboration between different partners. You want to minimize your risk of each participant's assets to liability. So this is getting into some pretty legal stuff here, but we do think it's something that commercial parties would definitely be thinking of, and no reason to think that you wouldn't be either. You want to maximize your return from your activities. Again, maybe not the types of things you're normally thinking of, but what we're talking about is primarily minimizing tax, using your funds for your objects. You want to preserve tax exemptions that are available to you. So charitable status, property tax, and sales taxes all come into play. You want to minimize the impact on existing funding sources. So to the extent that money's been allocated to one thing in particular, you want to be able to make sure that you have other pools of money available and can use that in a flexible way. And I think James, your chart showing the different boxes and how that can now be used for the entire hub is a great example of that. But your structure can also be relevant to how you are able to use your funds. So you can dovetail the more flexible government policies with actually the way you structure your hub and making sure you can use that money. Next is the impact on existing third-party relationships. Something to think about in terms of how you deal with others, how you deal with perhaps donors, how you deal with other contractual relationships that you might have in place. How will the hub impact those? Is it sustainable? I think that's something that Bill has definitely talked about in terms of creating a sustainable long-term hub that has flexibility, room for growth, room for change. You don't want to be too prescriptive in what it is you're doing because by its very nature, it's something that is going to evolve over time. And then finally, again, the lawyers, we're always concerned about the exit strategy. Things don't always work out. And so to the extent that there needs to be a fundamental change in the way that you've created your hub, you need to make sure you have a system set up in place to do that. So there's really two main ways, and there's lots of combinations and permutations on how you do this. But in our minds, there's sort of two main ways that you can structure a hub. So the one would be to create a new entity that's created specifically for the hub. It can be a corporation, charity, or not-for-profit. And the objects of the hub would be complementary to, but separate from the objects of the individual partners. So to the extent that the role within the hub itself is to serve a certain community, it would have a certain broad set of objects that is different than perhaps each of its own individual partners. And then I think what's been more common, and certainly the ones that I've dealt with more specifically myself, is a collective of separate entities, typically with a lead agency who owns or is the anchor tenant of the real estate, and then enters into leases, subleases, licenses with the other partners. So some considerations just to get into specifically. So the first is property tax rebates. So a registered charity hub can receive 40% provincial or municipal tax rebates on the property taxes that it otherwise pays. So obviously you want to be able to take advantage of that. In a hospital situation, I know there's exemptions obviously from property tax. So again, those might be very relevant. The creation of a hub may indirectly result in new rebates for partner organizations, who independently on their own wouldn't have an availability of a rebate to them. So that might be a bit of a windfall or an opportunity for those organizations. Also think about the administrative burden. Again, if you have 20 different entities, all who make their applications for property tax rebates on a separate form, you could, in theory, especially if you had, as Bill was talking about, a hub coordinator type individual, that person could make one application and then flow the benefits through to the organizations in a different manner. And a similar analysis, which I won't get into detail, but may apply to the HST rebates that are available for hospitals, which is 11.11% of the 14%, and charities, which is 9.06% of the 14%. Again, you can play with that, and hopefully you can take advantage of the best rebate that's available. In terms of risk allocation, think about what each organization has to do to run its operations, and there might be certain licensing or regulatory requirements that that pertain to that particular organization, which don't pertain to others within the hub. And so that would be, I think, for the most part, a reason to keep them separate, as opposed to creating a new legal entity. An example would be childcare centers. You think about a license, specific staffing, operating, and space requirements. And I'm sure in the health world, there are many different types of uses that have very specific licensing and regulatory requirements. The new hub entity with focused objects may have a more streamlined regulatory compliance regime and lower administrative burden. So that would be if the hub has enough synergy in its different users, again, you might be able to lower your administrative burden by making one application for a license that applies to the hub, as opposed to each individual entity having to get a separate license or what have you. But as I say, alternatively, you might want to keep them separate to ensure that the risk stays with the entity that has the particular use that could lead to penalties, fines, whatever, if it wasn't complied with. So when we're talking about leasing, these are things that I think, sometimes are common sense, but other times just keep in mind, a bit unique to a hub. So again, it's not a typical leased space where you have your office space or space within a building and it's clearly demised from all the other users. These hubs tend to be much more open in terms of the concept. The wayfinding signage, as Bill mentioned, is going to be pretty critical. So you want to make sure you define in your lease documentation, what is the common space, what's exclusive use space, and make sure everybody is aware of that. Reception areas, meeting rooms, kitchen, outdoor spaces, have to know everybody's rights to use those things, and certain times, boardroom allocation, for example, who gets to use it at what times, what's the process for that. Shared services, you'll very often have shared receptionists, security, janitorial, things like that. How do you contract for those, who pays for it, etc. Utilities, not likely to be separately metered, so to the extent that you have different users who have different usages of utilities, you may have to account for that. Dispute resolution, obviously critical. I think Bill was mentioning it does happen from time to time that one of your partners may not be happy with the way something's going on at the hub, so you have to have a mechanism to deal with that. Obviously, I think if you have a landlord-tenant relationship, it's usually the landlord has quite a bit of leverage in resolving disputes, in my experience, and probably in yours as well. If you create a single-purpose entity to be the hub, it's going to be a very different model, and it's going to be something that people probably aren't used to, but more collaborative and more less sort of one party sort of dictating how things will always be resolved. I'm going to get a bit to this in a specific example, but the lead organization wants to de-risk itself a bit in terms of its funding and other risks associated with the building. So it's going to want to put certain conditions on the other users. They want to know what it is they're using the space for, making sure insurance is in place, making sure it's very clear about allocating risk in the event of damage to the building, making sure you have control over further subleasing of space or assigning to another entity. I'll get into my example, but making sure that the funding is not jeopardized by what another partner in the hub might do or might not do. So this is a file I worked on. Obviously keep it confidential, but it is, we call it the Ontario Best Start Hub. This was a hub that focused on early child care servicing in Northern Ontario. We had one lead organization that very similar to Bill's situation had ownership of the real estate, which is a nice position to be in. And they worked with 4 partner organizations for the hub, and the funding organization was what the DSAB. There was a $2.66 million grant to do the renovation work to create the hub, and then the way the model worked was over a period of 5 years, 1/5 of the grant money would be forgiven so long as the hub performed what it was mandated to do by the DSAB, and at the end of the 5 years, so long as they were in compliance with those conditions, there would be no requirement to repay the grant. So as I say, it was a direct funding relationship between the DSAB and the lead organization. And I explained a bit about how the way the money would be allocated and then ultimately forgiven over a 5-year period. And these are some of the conditions that were associated with the funding. So the lead organization was responsible for cost overruns. They had to use commercial reasonable efforts to provide or cause its partners to provide very specific services. There was requirements to repay if the property is closed or sold. Indemnities associated with proof of insurance, and getting approval for any future expansion, reduction, or any assignments of who the users would be. And then obviously an obligation to comply with law. So what we were concerned with so we were acting for the lead organization, and so when we created the tenants, when we worked on the licenses or tenant relationships, we wanted to de-risk that a little bit in terms of, they're not the only organization in this space. The other organizations are going to obviously be paying a rent, but also I think getting the benefit of this funding to in the long term to get their program going. So we thought it was only fair for them to take on some of the risk associated with the grant and the project itself. So again, we created a rent that we obviously that you're not able to make any profit off of your rent, but we did everything we could to ensure that there was full cost recovery. We wanted to, again, make sure that there was proof of insurance. We had very strict controls over assignment and subletting, agreement to comply with laws. We put in a really sort of detailed language around if there was a default, which could impact the funding, that partner would be responsible for a monetary amount tied to the space they had in the building and the amount that had to be repaid. So I'm going to talk a bit about social enterprise. I should say that I'm a real estate guy. I've created these slides with my partner Nick Pasquino, who's a charity not-for-profit lawyer. So this is definitely more his area than mine. But certainly part of the possibility of these hubs is that there might be a bit of a for-profit element to it. And so you know, obviously that allows you to use your funds more for your programming and less for ongoing building maintenance, things like that. So certainly it's something that can happen, but you have to be extremely careful about how you do it. And so in the case of charities, there are, well, basically this first slide is talking about the risks. If you don't do it the right way, it can get very serious, including imprisonment, if it's obviously done in an almost fraudulent manner. But I don't think we're talking about that in most cases. But I think what does happen is it's an innocent mistake, but the CCA is really clamping down on this. It's high on their radar. They really do not want not-for-profits and charities to be doing this offside of the law. So for charities, which I think we're probably dealing with in most cases, we are dealing with charities. You can run a for-profit part of the business, but it has to be linked and subordinate to the charity's charitable purposes. And it's interesting, one thing you'll want to do when you're in a hub is look at your objects. Your objects as a charity may say one thing, what you're actually doing in the hub may be something slightly different. And so to the extent that you have a bit of this for-profit business, it might be linked and subordinate to what you're doing in the hub, but when you looked at your actual objects, it actually might not be linked and subordinate. So that's something to be careful about. The other thing about linked and subordinate that would impact creating a new entity is obviously the for-profit part of that business will be a bigger percentage of the new entity, and so it may not be seen as subordinate anymore. So in that case, it might be better to keep the entity separate, have the biggest entity do the for-profit business so that it's truly seen as being subordinate. Not-for-profits, it's an even tougher world. You really have no ability to conduct a profitable enterprise as part of what you're doing. So there are ways to structure it. You can create a subsidiary corporation that has a for-profit entity, and it gets pretty technical, so I won't get into that in great detail. This is just for the takeaway about our firm and how we can help out with these types of projects. So thanks very much.